Sun Tzu once said, "All warfare is based on deception." But even the great Chinese strategist could hardly have imagined a war where deception would become an industrial standard, a war where a lie would weigh 40 tons, yet could be lifted by a single soldier with one hand. Picture Normandy, 1944. A German observer scans the horizon through high-powered binoculars. He sees a formidable sight. Dozens of American Sherman tanks camouflaged in the tree line. He sees trucks, artillery pieces. He hears the roar of engines and the clanking of tracks. He immediately reports to headquarters, "Large tank formation spotted here. Prepare for an attack." The Germans open up with withering artillery fire. The ground shakes. Shells tear through the American positions. But then something strange happens. When a piece of shrapnel hits a tank, the machine doesn't explode, it doesn't burn. It simply makes a quiet pfft sound, slowly deflates, and settles onto the ground, turning into a pile of rubberized fabric. Welcome to the story of the strangest, most creative, and most secretive unit of World War II. This is not a story about how to destroy the enemy with fire. This is a story about how to drive him insane. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, men who fought with air, sonic speakers, and acting skills. Let's go back a bit. 1943. American command realizes that brute force alone is not enough to win in Europe. The Wehrmacht is an experienced and dangerous beast. The Atlantic Wall seems impenetrable. To win, you have to outsmart the enemy. You have to force him to see things that aren't there and to miss things that are. Deep within the Pentagon, an idea is born to create a unique unit. But who do you recruit? Ordinary soldiers know how to shoot and dig foxholes, but they don't know how to create illusions. The army didn't need warriors. They needed artists. Recruiters didn't go to shooting ranges or gyms. They went to the most unexpected places for the military, to the art institutes of New York and Philadelphia, to the ad agencies of Madison Avenue. They were looking for set decorators, illustrators, architects, and fashion designers. People with high IQs and, most importantly, lateral thinking. Among the recruits were future legends. For instance, Bill Blass, a man who, years later, would become an icon of American fashion. Or Ellsworth Kelly, a future giant of minimalism. These creative types were gathered at Camp Forest in Tennessee. It was perhaps the strangest camp in the history of the U.S. Army. Picture the scene. Grizzled drill sergeants trying to teach marching drills to guys who, during breaks, are discussing cubism, color theory, and the nuances of charcoal shading. One veteran later recalled, "In a regular infantry company, if you're drawing in a sketchbook, you might get beat up. In our company, if you weren't drawing, they looked at you like you were an idiot." But behind this bohemian atmosphere lay titanic work. They had to master 4 arts, which in the language of war became the 4 pillars of deception: visual, sonic, radio, and atmosphere. Their motto was, "We simulate strength where we have none, to hide it where we do." Let's break down their arsenal. The Ghost Army's main caliber weapon was air, literally. Engineers created inflatable replicas of M4 Sherman tanks, trucks, jeeps, and even airplanes. Making an inflatable tank that looks real from a distance is a complex engineering challenge. It's not a pool float. The first prototypes popped in the heat and lost their shape in the cold. They had to develop a complex system of internal bulkheads, a pneumatic framework that held the shape of the turret, and most difficult of all, the long cannon barrel. Deflated, such a tank weighed about 90 pounds, 40 kilos. and fit into a large duffel bag. The battalion could deploy the appearance of an entire tank division in just a couple of hours. But simply inflating a tank and placing it in a field wasn't enough. German reconnaissance pilots were professionals, they looked for details, and the artists of the 23rd knew this. They knew that a 30-ton tank leaves tracks. An inflatable tank leaves no tracks. So, before setting up a position, a real bulldozer would drive out onto the field at night. It would carve deep ruts into the mud, simulating the movement of heavy armor. Then, soldiers would gently, by hand, place the inflatable tanks right into these tracks. The art of camouflage was also used in reverse. Usually, the military tries to hide equipment. The ghosts, however, would cover their inflatable models with camouflage netting. But they did it carelessly on purpose. They would leave a piece of armor exposed so that a German pilot at 6,000 feet would catch a glint and think, "Aha! I found you." It was a double bluff, pure psychology. But if the visual deception was the body of the ghost, sound was its voice. And that voice had to be terrifying. The sonic deception was handled by the 3103nd Signal Service Company, under the command of Colonel Hilton Rayleigh. This was a man who understood that fear often enters through the ears, especially at night. There was no digital recording at the time. The technology of the future was recording sound onto magnetic wire. Specialists went to Fort Knox, the base of the real armored forces, to record the war. They created a unique library of sounds: the roar of tank engines, the clanking of tracks on asphalt, the squelching of wheels in mud, the sounds of bridge building, the shouting of sergeants. To play back these sounds, engineers from Bell Labs created monstrously powerful speakers. They weighed over 500 pounds and were mounted on half-tracks. This system could project sound up to 15 miles away. Imagine: night, fog, silence. German soldiers in trenches on the other side of the river suddenly hear a rising rumble. They hear a massive column of tanks approaching. They hear trucks getting stuck, men cursing as they try to pull them out. The Germans panic and call in artillery. They waste shells, firing at grid coordinates. But in reality, out there in the dark, there are just a couple of American half-tracks with speakers, and a sound operator is simply changing records, mixing sounds like a DJ at a deadly disco. The third element was the radio game, radio spoofing. The Germans were famous for their radio intelligence. They listened to the airwaves around the clock. Moreover, they knew the handwriting of every American radio man. Every Morse code operator has a unique rhythm, a so-called fist. Some hold pauses a bit longer, some tap faster. The radio men of the Ghost Army were the elite. They spent months training to mimic the style of radio men from real combat divisions. They created entire virtual worlds on the airwaves. They transmitted fake orders for attacks, complaints about fuel shortages, requests for maps of specific sectors. A German analyst would intercept these messages, connect the dots, and place a report on a general's desk. The 75th Infantry Division is located in Sector B. Even though, in reality, the 75th Division was moving secretly 100 miles away, maintaining complete radio silence. And finally, the fourth element, the boldest one, what they called atmosphere or special effects. Inflating a tank is half the battle. You have to make the local civilians and spies in the rear believe the army is real. The artists of the unit painted and sewed fake shoulder patches. They stenciled the bumpers of their jeeps with the insignia of whatever division they were impersonating at the moment. In the evenings, they staged real theater. A few trucks with soldiers, there were always at least 2 men in the back, the so-called rule of 2, to create the illusion of occupancy, would start circling through the nearest town, creating the illusion of an endless convoy. Actor officers would go into local bars and cafes. They would order wine and omelets and loudly, in secret, complain about their fate. "Oh, my boys are completely exhausted, but the colonel says we move out east at dawn tomorrow." They knew that German informants were sitting in the room. They were performing for them. This required nerves of steel. One mistake in the details of a uniform, one wrong gesture, and you could be exposed. And the ghosts had practically no heavy weaponry. In a real fight against tanks, they would be doomed. Their only defense was their lie. The unit faced its first major baptism of fire in Brest, France, in August 1944. There, they learned important lessons. For example, it turned out that inflatable tanks were too vulnerable to shrapnel. When the shelling started, the rubber machines began to deflate. They had to urgently create resuscitation teams that crawled under fire with buckets of glue and patches, sealing the punctured tanks like bicycle inner tubes so that the illusion wouldn't collapse in front of the enemy's eyes. But the Ghost Army's grandest performance was the operation on the Rhine in March 1945. This was the finale of the war. The Allies needed to cross the Rhine, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Germans had massed all their remaining forces there. U.S. command planned a crossing for the massive Ninth Army. But if the Germans learned the exact location, it would be a slaughter. General Eisenhower set the task, convinced the Germans that the crossing would take place at the city of Viersen, 10 miles away from the real location. The Ghosts had only a few days, and only 1,100 men. They had to portray 2 full-strength infantry divisions. That's 30,000 soldiers, a ratio of 1 to 30. They gave it everything they had. Over 600 dummy tanks and artillery pieces were inflated. Fake airfields were built with fake L-5 observation planes made of bamboo and canvas. The sound engineers worked at maximum capacity. They set up speakers along the river and played the sounds of a giant pontoon bridge being built. The banging of hammers, the screeching of winches, beams falling into the water. Loud commands. The Germans on the other bank listened all night as the Americans built a crossing. Moreover, the Americans used a cunning trick. They allowed German reconnaissance planes to fly over the fake positions, but at the same time opened furious, though intentionally inaccurate, anti-aircraft fire. The logic was simple. If they are protecting this area so fiercely, something important must be hidden there. And the Germans bought it. They shifted the bulk of their artillery and tank reserves to the Ghost Army's location. Hell broke loose. The Germans opened massive fire. They churned up empty fields, blowing up rubber decoys. The soldiers of the 23rd sat in deep shelters and prayed that a stray shell wouldn't hit the trucks with the equipment. This was their finest hour. They were taking the hit. At the same time, 10 miles to the south, the real U.S. Ninth Army began crossing the Rhine. Soldiers boarded boats expecting a wall of fire, expecting death. But the river was quiet. The opposite bank was practically empty. The enemy was looking the other way. The enemy was fighting ghosts. Casualties during the crossing were minimal. The operation was a brilliant success. It is estimated that in this single operation, the actions of the 23rd Unit saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. The war ended. Europe celebrated victory. Soldiers returned home as heroes, telling stories of assaults and battles. But the soldiers of the Ghost Army returned home with a heavy burden, the burden of silence. The Pentagon classified their activities as top secret. The Cold War had begun, and the American government decided that deception technologies could be useful against a new enemy, the Soviet Union. They were strictly forbidden to talk about their service, even to their wives and children. Imagine the drama. You return from a war where you risked your life every day, where you fooled Hitler himself. Your son asks, "Dad, what did you do in the war? Did you shoot Nazis?" And you are forced to answer, "I guarded warehouses in the rear," or "I just drove cargo trucks." Everyone thought they were rear echelon rats, guys who sat out the war in safety. And they couldn't say a thing to defend themselves. They kept this secret for over 50 years. Surprisingly, the experience gained in the Ghost Army greatly influenced their later lives. Many of them became famous artists and designers. Ellsworth Kelly admitted that his fascination with form and shadow, his minimalism, came from there, from the fields of France, where he learned to break up silhouettes and deceive the eye. Bill Blass used camouflage principles in fashion, creating clothes that corrected the figure. They learned to see the world differently, as a set piece that can be changed by the power of imagination. It was only in 1996 that the secrecy was lifted. The world was astonished to learn of the existence of the 23rd. But by that time, many veterans were no longer alive. They took their secret to the grave. And only very recently, in 2024, justice was finally served. 3 of the remaining survivors of the Ghost Army, all over 100 years old, received the Congressional Gold Medal, the country's highest civilian honor. They sat in their wheelchairs in the Capitol while politicians gave speeches, and perhaps they were remembering not the shine of the medals, but that sound. The sound of a deflating tank in the middle of a night field. The story of the Ghost Army teaches us an important lesson. We are used to thinking that war is a competition between armor and projectile. Who has the thicker steel? Who has the bigger caliber? But these 1,100 artists proved that creativity can be just as deadly a weapon. That imagination can stop a tank division. They were illusionists on the bloodiest stage in human history, and their best trick wasn't disappearing themselves. It was making the enemy disappear, simply by making him believe in an illusion. They showed us that sometimes the most noble truth can be hidden inside a giant, inflatable, rubber lie.